The night my son told me to leave his restaurant in front of 60 guests, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I set down my water glass, reached into my jacket pocket, and pulled out my phone. I dialed my attorney's number right there at the table. "Tom," I said, quietly enough that only the people nearest to me could hear. "Go ahead, with everything we talked about." Then I put the phone away, looked at my son just once, and walked out. By Thursday morning, he had 3 certified letters waiting at his door. By the following Monday, he was calling me 42 times. I didn't answer a single one. I had driven 40 minutes to get to that restaurant. Not because I enjoyed the drive. The interstate through downtown gets brutal on Friday evenings, but because my son had finally, after months of vague promises and rescheduling, invited me to the soft opening of his second location. I'd been waiting for that invitation for a long time. My name was on the original lease. Not his. I should back up. My wife passed away 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. The kind that moves fast and doesn't give you much time to prepare. We had 41 years together, Ellen and I. We met at a community college in Ohio when we were both 22. She was studying accounting. I was studying nothing in particular, just trying to figure out what came next. She figured it out for me, in the best possible way. We built everything together: our home, our savings, 2 kids, a landscaping business that eventually grew into something much larger than either of us had expected. By the time I sold it at 60, we had enough to be comfortable for the rest of our lives. We just didn't count on the rest of our lives ending so soon for her. After Ellen died, I wasn't much use to anyone for a long while. My daughter, my younger one, who teaches middle school math in Colorado and calls me every Sunday without fail, was worried about me. She offered to fly out, to stay for the summer, to do whatever I needed. I told her I'd be okay. I wasn't sure I believed it, but I told her anyway. My son, who lives 20 minutes from me, came by twice in the first month. After that, the visits tapered off. He had a growing restaurant business, a demanding wife, a social calendar that seemed to have no room in it for a grieving old man who drove a 10-year-old pickup truck and wore work boots to every occasion. I didn't push. I never pushed with him. What I did do, about 8 months after Ellen passed, was offer to help him expand. He'd been running his first location successfully for a few years, a nice farm-to-table place on the east side of the city that his wife had designed the interior of. It was doing well. He wanted a second spot, something bigger, more upscale, closer to the theater district. He had the vision. What he didn't have was the capital. I gave him $600,000. Not as a loan, as a gift. His inheritance. Early. I set up the LLC with him, co-signed the commercial lease on the new building, and stepped back. I didn't want credit. I didn't want a seat at the table, metaphorically speaking. I just wanted to see him succeed. That was 4 years ago. In those 4 years, I can count on one hand the number of times he invited me anywhere that wasn't a holiday obligation. Christmas dinner at his house, where his wife's parents stayed for the full week, and I drove home alone at 9 o'clock. Thanksgiving, where he spent most of the meal on his phone with a supplier. His wife's birthday party, where I showed up in slacks and a button-down and felt, from the moment I walked in, like I dressed wrong, talked wrong, stood in the wrong part of the room. I never said anything. I kept writing the checks when he asked an additional $40,000 here, $20,000 there, small things that added up quietly. He never asked how I was doing. The invitation to the soft opening came by text 3 days before the event. Casual, almost afterthought level. "Hey Dad, opening night Friday, 7 p.m. Thought you might want to stop by." I texted back immediately. Told him I'd be there. Told him I was proud of him. I meant both things. I got dressed that Friday evening with more care than I'd taken in years. I found a blazer in the back of my closet, dark navy, the one I'd worn to my granddaughter's baptism, and put on a clean dress shirt underneath. I drove to the theater district, paid $12 to park in a garage, and walked 2 blocks in the October cold to the front door of a restaurant with my son's name above it. The room was full. 60 people, maybe more. White tablecloths, candles, a bar along the back wall with a bartender in a vest who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine. My daughter-in-law had outdone herself with the design exposed, brick, warm lighting, leather banquettes. It really was beautiful. I spotted my son near the bar, holding court with a group of men in expensive suits. He saw me come in, and something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly. Something more like recalibration. I made my way over. He introduced me to the men he was with. "This is my father," he said. And that was it. No elaboration. The men nodded politely, and conversation resumed around me, as though I weren't there. I stood for a moment on the edge of that circle, then excused myself and found a seat near the window. A server brought me water. I ordered the short rib because Ellen always said I should order the thing I actually want, not the second cheapest thing on the menu. Old habit. The dinner went on. People spoke, laughed, clinked glasses. My daughter-in-law moved through the room like she'd been born to host events like this, touching arms, leaning in close, laughing at exactly the right moments. She glanced at me once from across the room. She didn't come over. The speeches started around 8:30. My son stood near the bar and began thanking people. His wife, his chef, his investors, a group of 3 men who came in at the last stage of funding, and who were acknowledged with long, warm paragraphs. His mentor from culinary school. He did not mention me. I told myself that was fine. This was his night. Then someone in the audience asked how he'd gotten the original capital off the ground. He smiled and said it had taken years of savings and sacrifice, and smart partnerships. That was it, Heaven Marcus. Years of savings and sacrifice. And I still told myself it was fine. What happened next was not fine. A man at the table next to mine leaned over during a lull and asked if I was in the industry. I told him no, that I was the owner's father. He smiled pleasantly and said, "Oh, he doesn't talk about his family much." And before I could respond, my son appeared beside us. I hadn't even seen him walk over. "Dad." His voice was quiet, but with an edge in it. "Can I talk to you for a second?" I followed him toward a narrow hallway near the kitchen. My daughter-in-law was already there, arms crossed, her smile the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "What's going on?" I asked. My son exhaled through his nose. "Look, tonight is important. We've got press here, investors, people who matter for the next phase of this place. And I need you to understand that the way you engage with people, the way I engage with people, you told the table next to you that you used to drive a truck. I did drive a truck. That was my company. Dad." His wife touched his arm. He looked at the floor, then back at me. "I need you to not do that tonight. These people have there's a culture here, and I need tonight to go smoothly. Maybe it would be better if you headed out. I'll call you this week. We'll do dinner. Just the 2 of us." I stood there in that hallway for a moment. 41 years of building something with Ellen. 4 years of writing checks, signing leases, stepping quietly to the side so he could have his moment. 20 minutes in a parking lot every Thanksgiving, trying not to feel like a stranger at my own son's table. And now this. A narrow hallway, his wife's tight smile, and the suggestion that I leave. I said, "Okay." I walked back out into the dining room. I did not go directly to the door. I went back to my table, picked up my jacket, and then I did the thing I had planned weeks before, the thing Tom and I had discussed at length, and set in motion quietly, the thing that was already done on paper and just needed one phone call to activate. I dialed Tom's number. "Tom," I said, not loudly but not whispering either. "Go ahead with everything we talked about." My son was watching from across the room. I saw his face change. I put the phone in my pocket, looked at him for a long moment, and then I walked out the front door. The October air hit me hard. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute, breathing it in, watching a couple walk past hand in hand, laughing about something private. I found my truck. I drove home. My phone started ringing before I reached the highway. I turned on the radio instead. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about Ellen. I thought about the way she used to sit across from me at this same table after the kids were in bed, talking through whatever was weighing on us. She always knew when something was wrong before I said a word. She'd pour herself a glass of water, sit down, look at me, and say, "Tell me." There was no one to say that to me anymore. But I wasn't falling apart. I was, for the first time in a very long time, remarkably clear. Whatever grief I'd been carrying, the quiet, grinding kind that comes from being made to feel like a burden by your own child, it had dropped away somewhere between that hallway and the front door. What was left felt almost like relief. I checked my phone. 11 missed calls. 2 voicemails. I didn't listen to them. I went to bed. By morning, my attorney had sent 3 things. A formal notice of withdrawal from the LLC, a certified letter to the property management company, stating that as co-signer and guarantor on the commercial lease, I was exercising my right to review and renegotiate the terms, and a letter to my son's personal accountant, noting that the gift documentation we'd filed 4 years ago would be re-examined in light of certain conditions that had not been met. Tom is thorough. That's why I've used him for 15 years. The certified letters arrived at my son's door on Thursday. He called me 42 times that day. His wife called 11 more. I know these numbers because I checked the log later, not because I picked up. He came to my house on Saturday morning. I watched through the front window as he knocked, then knocked again. I had parked my truck in the garage, so he couldn't tell from the driveway whether I was home. He stood on my porch for 8 minutes. I checked the clock and then drove away. A letter arrived 5 days later. Not handwritten, typed, printed, formal. It was from his attorney. 2 pages of language about partnership obligations, about my role in the LLC, about the fact that my withdrawal from the agreement could expose me to damages. I forwarded it to Tom with 2 words: handle it. Tom called me that afternoon. The LLC agreement is clean, he said. Your exit clause is airtight. I drafted it with exactly this scenario in mind. He paused. Did you know 4 years ago this might happen? I hoped it wouldn't, I said. The social media campaign started the following week. My daughter-in-law posted something long and carefully worded "I know" because my sister-in-law texted me a screenshot. The post talked about a controlling father-in-law who was weaponizing finances to punish a family that had worked themselves to the bone for years. It got shared 300 times. Most of the comments were sympathetic. A good portion were skeptical. I did not respond online. What I did was call 3 people who knew both me and my son, my neighbor of 20 years, my former business partner, and Ellen's brother, and I told each of them exactly what had happened. Not a speech, just the facts, the invitation, the hallway, the words, the phone call. Every one of them said the same thing, more or less. You have nothing to apologize for. Ellen's brother called me back 2 days later. He had run into my daughter-in-law at a grocery store. She'd told him a version of events that left out several key details. He called her on it, and the conversation had not gone well. I told him I was sorry he'd been put in the middle. He said, "Don't be." Ellen would have been furious. I had to put the phone down for a moment after he said that. I called my daughter that Sunday, as I do every week. She'd seen something about the situation through a mutual connection and had been waiting for me to bring it up. When I finished telling her everything, she was quiet for a long moment. "Dad," she said finally, "I've been watching this happen for years. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make it worse. But I want you to know whatever you decide, I'm with you. Not because he's wrong and you're right, but because you matter. You deserve to be treated like you matter." That hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. "I know I'm not the one he called for money," she added. "I know I'm not the one you set up an LLC with. But for what it's worth, I'm the one calling you every Sunday." I said, "I know, sweetheart. I know." We talked for an hour and a half. When we hung up, I sat in my living room in the quiet and made a decision about the other thing I'd been putting off for 6 years. I called Tom and asked him to fit me in for a will. His office was in a building downtown I hadn't been to since we closed the sale of my landscaping company. He met me in the lobby, shook my hand, led me to a conference room with a view of the river. "You know what the state does if you die without a will," he said, not as a question. "My son gets everything. Your son gets everything." He set his pen down. "Is that what you want?" "No," I said. "It is not." We spent 2 hours going through it. My assets, The house. 2 rental properties I'd held onto after the business sold. Investment accounts. Retirement accounts. Total. Somewhere between 2 and 2.5 million, depending on the market. What I wanted. 60% to a foundation I would establish for workforce housing. Ellen and I had talked about this for years. The shortage of affordable housing for working families. The way the city we'd built a business in was becoming impossible for ordinary people to afford. 25% split between 3 organizations. The hospice that had cared for Ellen in her final weeks, the community college where we had met, and a veterans organization I'd been quietly donating to for a decade. The remaining 15% split between my 2 children, but not equally. My daughter, 10%, unconditional. She'd never asked me for anything. She'd called every Sunday for 6 years. My son, 5%, with one condition. If he carried personal debt at the time of my death, that 5% would redirect to the hospice instead. Tom looked at me over his reading glasses. He'll contest it. Let him try. It's my money. Yes, Tom said. It is. I signed the documents on a Friday afternoon. When it was done, I sat in my truck in the parking garage and thought about whether I felt anything. Something like guilt, maybe. Not regret, I was clear on that, but the particular ache of a decision that shouldn't have needed to be made. I had given my son $600,000. I had co-signed a lease, absorbed the financial risk, stepped quietly to the side so he could stand in the spotlight. I had not asked him to love me more for it. I had only asked him, without words, to remember that I was there. He had chosen not to remember. The will stood. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. I went back to my routines. Morning coffee on the porch, a walk around the neighborhood, the occasional lunch with friends from the old business. I had been let go slowly from my own life for 6 years, and I was finding out what was left when the parts that no longer fit were removed. Then came a call I least expected, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, while I was raking leaves in the backyard. A number I didn't recognize. Something made me answer. It was my daughter-in-law. She didn't start with an apology. She started with a question. Did you know about the lease? That your co-signature wasn't necessary anymore? I found out recently, I said. Yes. A long silence. He should have told you. He should have. I'm not calling to make excuses, she said carefully. What happened at the restaurant, the way we handled it, I've been thinking about it every day since. A pause. What I want you to know is that it wasn't about you, specifically. It was about what we thought the room needed to see. I understand what you thought the room needed, I said. I'm telling you what it cost. She didn't answer immediately. I don't know if this can be fixed, she said finally. It probably can't be fixed, I said. But it can be different. That's a separate thing. We talked for 20 minutes. It wasn't warm, and nothing was resolved, but it was the first conversation between us in years where something true was being said on both ends. I didn't tell my son about the call. I don't know if she did. December came. I had not seen my son since the morning he stood on my porch for 8 minutes. My daughter flew in for Christmas week. She stayed in the guest room, cooked in my kitchen, watched football with me on the couch, and did not once bring up her brother, unless I did. On Christmas Eve, she sat across from me at the kitchen table where Ellen and I used to sit, and she asked me how I was actually doing. Better, I said, and I meant it. She had started a college fund for her daughter, my granddaughter, and asked if I wanted to contribute. I said yes. We spent an hour making it official, something small and practical and forward-looking. Ellen would have approved. On Christmas morning, I drove to the church where Ellen and I had married. I hadn't been since her funeral. I sat in a back pew and didn't cry, which surprised me. I just sat there in the quiet for an hour, listening to the organ, thinking about 41 years of choosing the same person every day. The people who'd loved me best had not loved me for what I owned. In February, the foundation filing went through. We called it the Ellen Barrett Housing Fund. My name is Richard Barrett, but I didn't care whose name was on it. It was hers. She had cut articles about housing policy out of magazines for 20 years and left them on my nightstand. had donated every year to local shelters in amounts larger than our budget strictly allowed. This was the thing she would have built if she'd had the time. My son found out about the foundation from a mutual acquaintance. He called me for the first time since November. I answered, because I had decided at some point in the month since the restaurant that avoiding him indefinitely was not the resolution I wanted. I wasn't ready to forgive, but I was willing to hear. You named something after Mom, he said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded the way a person sounds when something they thought was settled turns out not to be. She would have built it herself, I said, if she'd had more time. A long pause. Dad, I want to apologize. I'm listening. What I said in that hallway, the way my wife and I handled it, it was wrong. He paused again. I think I've been afraid to call you because I don't know how to explain it. Why I did it. Why we've both done it. You don't have to explain it tonight, I said. But I want you to understand something. I didn't pull back to punish you. I did it because I realized I had been making myself smaller for years, taking up less room so you could have more, and it wasn't working. You still didn't see me. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear him trying to find words. I know, he said finally. I know. We did not solve anything on that call, but we ended it without anger, and that felt significant. I told him I'd be open to talking more in the spring. He said he'd be there. When I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time in the quiet. I had spent 6 years since Ellen died, making myself easy to overlook, accommodating, invisible, useful only for what I could provide. I had confused generosity with worthiness, as if giving enough would make me someone they wanted in the room. The restaurant had cured me of that. Finally, I was not a man who needed a suit that cost more than a month's mortgage to deserve a seat at a table. I was not a man who drove a truck because he had failed. I drove a truck because I had built something real with my hands, and I was not ashamed of it. Ellen never asked me to be ashamed of it. My daughter never asked me to be ashamed of it. The only people who had were the ones who needed something from me. In March, I booked a flight to Yellowstone. Ellen had always wanted to see it in winter. The bison in the snow, the geysers in the cold air, the particular silence of a place that large in a season when most people stayed away. We'd planned it twice, and something came up both times. I went alone, with a carry-on bag and a photograph of her from our 30th anniversary. The park was extraordinary. I hiked more than I expected. I ate breakfast at a lodge each morning with other solo travelers and retired couples and said almost nothing. Just watched the light come up over the mountains and drank my coffee and felt, for long stretches at a time, genuinely at peace. One morning I found a pullout on a road overlooking a frozen river. I parked and got out and stood there in the cold for 20 minutes, watching a single bison move slowly across the white plain. Nothing dramatic, just an animal being what it was, in the middle of all that quiet space. When I got back home, there was a letter from my son, handwritten, his handwriting, not his wife's. 4 pages. He talked about therapy, which he and his wife had started in January. He talked about patterns he was beginning to see in himself. He did not ask for money. He did not ask about the will, though I suspected he'd heard about it. He only said that he was trying, that he was not asking me to trust him today, but that he hoped, someday, I might be open to it. The last paragraph was the one I read twice. He wrote, I keep thinking about something Mom used to say, that the hardest thing in any relationship is to see someone clearly and love them anyway. I don't think I've been seeing you clearly, Dad. I'm trying to start. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer of my bedside table. Not thrown away, not answered, just kept. Some things need time. Not the performative waiting of someone withholding forgiveness as punishment. I had no interest in that. Real time. The kind where a person changes not because it's convenient, but because they understand what they've lost. The foundation broke ground on the first project in April. 14 units of accessible senior housing in a neighborhood 3 miles from where Ellen and I had lived our entire adult lives. I went out one afternoon and stood at the edge of the cleared lot in my work boots and looked at the dirt and thought about what it would become. A young contractor introduced himself. Couldn't have been 30. He asked if I was the donor. I'm the donor, I said. Your wife's name is on the plans, he said. I just wanted to say my grandmother could use a place like this. I shook his hand and didn't say anything for a moment. On the drive home, I thought about all of it. The restaurant, the hallway, the phone call, the 42 missed calls, the letter in my drawer, the frozen river in Wyoming, the cleared lot in the neighborhood where Ellen and I had walked for 40 years. I thought about my daughter, who called every Sunday. I thought about my son, who was in therapy learning to see people clearly. I thought about Tom, who had drafted an exit clause 4 years before I needed it, just in case. I thought about Ellen, who had believed for 20 years that someone would eventually do something about it. I turned onto my street. My house looked the same as it always had. My phone buzzed. A text from my daughter. Thinking about you today. Love you, Dad. I typed back. Love you too, sweetheart. Talk Sunday. Then I went inside, made a pot of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table where Ellen and I had sat for 41 years. I was not the man who had driven 40 minutes to be quietly escorted out of his own son's life. I was not invisible, not inconvenient, not someone to be managed in a narrow hallway. I was Richard Barrett. I had built something real. I had loved someone real. And I was still here. That, I decided, was enough. It was more than enough. It was, finally, exactly what I had. If this story stayed with you, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity? I'd love to read your thoughts. And to hear the next story, click the video on your left.